when a race that I led up until a couple of laps before the pit stop in Brazil. So I led more laps than anyone else. I pitted. Then there was a huge crash that involved Fernando Alonso, Mark Webber. The beneficiary of that was you with Fisichella. Exactly.
I thought he'd never get around to it.
And I was robbed of a race victory because because we've done more.
You have a word with Ron Dennis because he's a dick. He absolutely made the wrong call. He should have known.
Yeah, we should have pitted
known
before
that the race would always go to 75%.
Yes.
And you didn't have enough fuel in the car because your engineers were not thinking through their head. That's why.
Okay, we did make a mistake, but in that situation...
That's why you lost. Blame them.
In that situation, calling a 75% race distance was I felt very unfair. But anyway, look...
That's the rules.
People don't say, David Coulthard, 14 times Grand Prix winner. Or 15 times, you're welcome for Spa 98.
You're trying to make me feel small.
Or 16 times, you're welcome Mika Hakkinen, 98 Melbourne. They go David who?
I have a violin in my case.
Right. Okay, well, let's come back to music in a moment, but there is one more question. This is from Sam, and he said that he's been listening to the episode where you, Eddie, were talking about team principles, and he wanted to know what it was like in the team meetings of your day, because I think this might be stimulated by Netflix has given us this Drive to Survive access where we saw the much memes and quoted little session between Toto Wolff complaining about porpoising and Christian Horner saying, change your effing car. And obviously there's an element of that's being filmed. Was it like that back in the day when you're sitting there with all the team principals, and I assume Bernie was in the room? Were you all having a fair crack of saying what you want, or was it basically one or two of you were the mouthpieces, and I guess you were quite vocal? How was it?
Well, those of you who either grew up or was part of the Bernie era will clearly know that there was only ever one leader, and that was him. He was the ringmaster. And he controlled absolutely everything. But then to be very fair, we just quantify that by saying, I've never met a better visionary in my entire life than him. He just had that magic. However, these team principal meetings was a joke. We decide, who was getting what money, and he would decide that Ferrari were getting 3% more than anyone else, irrespective of where they were on the grid or whatever happened. And it wasn't a question that we disagreed with that. We were kind of told beforehand, you will agree to this. But, he used to have, whenever someone confronted him, he had a great ability to divide and rule. So if he thought maybe three people were ganging up on him, he'd make it sure that he would make it so embarrassing for at least one or two of those that they crawled back down into their little hatch and sort of be quiet. And that was it. He controlled. He was a master. But he used to call me a robber. And he said, the robber is about to say something, guys. He had absolutely no regard for correctness or anything. But it was a joke, but it wasn't really a joke. And he would make it sure. And he said, Flavio, who was his friend, he said, Flavio, you're making a mistake. You should stick to selling T-shirts because, at least you know something about T-shirts. But that was his way of describing what he went on. And it went on from then. He called Frank, who was... very successful at the time, and he used to say, Frank, you know something? I think you're about the most devious person I've ever met in my life. And he used to come out and say these things in front of everybody, and no one ever cared. He said to Tom Walkinshaw was a classic, and Tom was there, and Tom was always very well behaved, and he had always certain good questions. But he put his hand up one day, he said, yes, Tom, what are you saying? I said, sorry, Tom, don't say anything. He said, I always know when you're lying. Tom, I always know when you're lying. And of course, Tom was about to say, oh, how, when, Bernie? He said, as soon as your lips move. And I'm saying, Jesus, how can you say something like that? There's someone sitting directly across the table. And Tom was about 5 times his side.
Yeah, he owned a big rugby guy.
Gloucester Rugby Club. Yeah. I always thought there was going to be fireworks. Bernie controlled everything. Make no mistake, I don't know what they're actually going to say in some of the movies that's coming out about Bernie, but when the story happens and when it really takes all the gloves off, I want to be able to see what is happening. It was hilarious. I'm not sure things were discussed, but he'd have the people from Luca de Montezemolo. He had them
from Ferrari.
Ferrari, absolutely, and they were, and they still are. The reality is that Bernie had a good vision. He said, guys, let's be clear. And for those younger people in the audience, remember that Formula One was never like this until Bernie came along. Formula One was a sort of a cowboy situation, that if Ferrari entered the race at, we say, the British Grand Prix, Ferrari, then the other teams would turn up. But all of the money for the entry would nearly have always gone to Ferrari, and the rest of the teams got the crumbs. So Bernie changed all that, and he decided to make it into a much bigger marketing effort. And he said, look, these teams are all committed, and that's where the 10 teams, the 10 get the pot and the share of the pot as to where you finish in the championship. So at least you could try and balance the books to see what was likely to come in. Whereas in the previous days, you were at the mercy of dealing with every different promoter, and that was not sustainable. Absolutely not sustainable. So well done to Bernie. There's no doubt that Formula One would not be where it is.
No, he's laid some incredible foundations, and then Liberty, an American company, have really come in and taken it to the next level.